Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and once again it is time for the Monday Q&As. So let's get this started. First question. Jason, why are gyms allowed to use weights, mainly referring to 45-pound plates, but I'm sure this applies to dumbbells as well, that are not properly calibrated to the weight they claim to be? Would that not create a potential for someone to hurt themselves if they don't always train at the same gym? Well, first of all, as far as the injury thing, no, minor variations. Yes, I recommend microloading and things like that to gradually give you gradual progressive overload. You aren't going to be able to tell any measurable difference oftentimes if there's a very small variation in the weights you're using as far as the reps you're using. Like a 5-rep max is probably going to be a 5-rep max for most people, whether it's 1 or 2% higher or lower. So the injury prevention thing is relatively low, and most people should be using metal safeties and things anyways, and be using an RPE scale as they ramp up, even if they're going towards a training max. As far as why you don't see this more closely regulated in gyms, it's a cost issue. If you go look at the price of calibrated plates versus plates that only need to be within 3 or 4%, the price gap is massive. It's massive. It would literally add to have, say, your average gym that has just 20, 45-pound plates in it. It would cost thousands and thousands of dollars to have those all as calibrated plates, like we use at powerlifting meets, where you know they're all the same size and they're actually adjustable. Like even when you make these plates, you're not going to be able to do cast iron plates that are consistently the same weight. You're going to have variations just of them being cast, just of them being roughed up in things a bit, and little specks of them break off as people train with them and wear and tear on them. You'd be surprised how much the variation is going to happen. And what we actually have with the calibrated plates, we have holes drilled in them. So not only are they machined plates, they have holes drilled in them so that you can put brass inserts into them to get them calibrated to the right weight. So if they're off by a pound or two, you can put inserts into them or remove inserts in order to get them to the correct weight, like actual weighted inserts that thread in. So you can actually change the weight on the plate slightly, and this dramatically raises the cost of plates. So it's a financial issue. Your gym memberships would go up in most gyms if they had all calibrated plates. It would be just massively more expensive. It would raise the cost of the equipment. And again, people are rough with the equipment. There's no way they're going to use calibrated plates in any gym where the average idiot gym rat is going to be using them, because they're going to break them and damage them, and they're very expensive. All right, next question. Level of acceptance of form degradation on squats for still adding weight on a 5x5. We're assuming you're using mind, where you're not really trying to take things to failure if you can avoid it. What I would call form degradation, if a spotter has to touch anything, or you have to cheat or really grind out a rep. Say on your bench press, you have to shift to the side a little bit and grind it to lock it out. We count that as a fail. That's a failed rep. The same on your squat. If it stops, or if the weight stops at any point, that's a good way too. If you ever stop in the middle of a rep and have to grind and push, and the weight seems to come to pretty much a dead stop at any point, and you have to adjust technique at all then to push past that and just grind through that sticking point, I would count that as a failed rep for purposes of things like my 5x5, because you've now hit an RPE 10 at that point. So that's as far as I would take it. I would count that as a failed rep when you're tallying it up in the book on something like my 5x5 program. All right, next question. Why have militaries not incorporated heavy barbell training into their regime? We know that lifting heavy weights does not make you slow, and heavy barbell training is partly responsible for developing some of the most powerful athletes on the planet. Are the military somewhat behind on exercise science? No, they actually aren't. You would be surprised. This is oftentimes optional, but a lot of your more elite forces, like things like U.S. Army Spec Ops, are provided access to barbells. They are encouraged to train with barbells. Although it's oftentimes optional for some units, and other units it is not optional for you to go do resistance training. And they do need to maintain a large amount of endurance, so there's always a focus on endurance, but there is strength training, power training, even CrossFit's popular. Olympic lifting is popular. All of those things are popular among some of your more elite infantry forces and airborne forces, at least in the U.S. military. And anabolic steroids are very, very popular. So it's more an issue of leaving some individual choice, because what it comes down to is it's hard to motivate someone to weightlift heavy in addition to other training. If a person isn't willing to do what they need to do to maintain their edge, when it comes time to testing people on what they're capable of in the field, they may get cut and lose their elite status, or they may not continue to be able to do that line of duty. They could suffer a pay cut, they could suffer a cut in rank. All sorts of things could happen if they're not able to perform optimally. And so if they do care about being the best, they'll go ahead and do the weight training because it is generally available to them, and even some forces deployed overseas in combat zones in some areas still have access to free weights. But I can't speak for all militaries around the world. I just know about the way this works inside the U.S. So it is actually actively encouraged. All right, next question. What are your views on completely fasted resistance training? Can it be effective for those who like to train first thing in the morning, or will it impede gains? I did this for well over 2 years. I did this actually up until fairly recently. I've done most of my training coming back fasted. Now I do eat first, I eat carbs first. I don't generally personally see a big difference between eating carbs first. But for me, I usually see my best performance if I eat a heavy carb meal before bed the night before a heavy session. But all in all, we could argue that weight training itself doesn't use a large amount of glycogen up. We just don't burn that many calories doing it unless you're doing almost cardio level volumes of it, in which case you're just replicating HIIT cardio at a certain threshold. But you'd be surprised how little you need, and if anything, a nice carb meal before bed can generally be enough for someone who wants to train fasted, and if you have a relatively long session, a little bit of intra-workout carbs can help. But if anything, it doesn't help as much as people think it do. It could for some individuals give a very small edge, but it's generally more endurance-oriented work that you're definitely going to want to carb load more beforehand, unless it's just list cardio and someone's trying to do fasted cardio for cutting. And even that is becoming a point of contention now as we have more research coming out. We're going to have to figure out if that's actually even useful or not, or you should be eating carbs before you do that type of cardio. But for weight training, it's going to come down to the individual. Some people just function better due to less blood flow in the stomach and the GI tract having to digest food, whereas in others seem to need the extra glucose. So it's really subject to debate. I know that I personally oftentimes do my best if I have a big carb meal the night before a morning session, even if I choose to train fasted. I don't really see a big difference in my fasted training or not, other than when I'm training fasted, sometimes I can see a little bit of a drop in blood sugar mid-session, in which case I need to go grab some carbs. It comes down to the individual really on these things. All right, next question. The body always burns and stores fat. It's the net turnover that counts. But since the body's preferred fuel source of energy is glycogen, this means that it only burns fat when your glucose stores are depleted. How the process works exactly? No, in fact, that's absurd. Your body will burn fat even in the presence of glucose unless you've just eaten a large amount and you have a high circulating insulin levels, in which case you're going to be burning glucose. If you have glycogen stores already stored in muscle tissue and liver tissue, your body only taps into those when other hormones that release them back into the bloodstream cause you to utilize them, which can also cause an insulin response as well. And you don't really see the same effect because it's already stored. You don't need circulating glucose from your body to react to store it, so therefore you don't have the circulating insulin in order to blunt the fat burning response in the body. So no, not at all. You don't need depleted glycogen at all. If your glycogen stores are full, your blood sugar levels and insulin levels are not elevated because the glucose is already stored and you're using a relatively low type of energy, so you're not pushing anaerobic type training like high intensity cardio or high volume weight training. Your body will be back to burning fat anyways, even though you have full glycogen stores. Because you don't have its preferred fuel source circulating, it's there for storage when you need it for a high burst of energy, or if blood sugar drops too low and it needs to pull it back out. So no, you're not looking at it correctly at all. Now, if you had just ate a bunch of table sugar and that's hitting your bloodstream and you're getting a big surge in blood sugar and a big surge in insulin response, then yes, that will blunt it and describe what you see, but glycogen stores themselves will not. All right, next question. Does a lifting belt actually protect your back, or does it just allow you to move more weight? Are there any benefits to using a belt other than for weightlifting, powerlifting, strongman, competition, specificity? The belt does not protect your back. If you have bad technique and problems where you're not loading your back correctly, you will injure yourself with or without a belt. Doesn't help at all. What the belt does is that it lets you use more intra-abdominal pressure to keep your torso more upright and to get a stronger neuromuscular response. So it lets you lift more weight. Now, as to whether that additional weight you're lifting transfers into more hypertrophy or strength is subject to a lot of debate. I personally don't train with a belt on my big lifts year round. I've gotten to where I'm doing the squat belted most of the year now because I deadlift without a belt year round, and I'm deadlifting at a high frequency now, so I don't need it. But for most people, I would say, yeah, the specificity of it, of training, is the main reason to have a belt. If you compete in something where you can use a belt and you know it's going to give you another 20 kilos on your total, then you use a belt. The other people who might want a belt are going to be people who are very concerned about excessive core development. They don't want an extra half inch of muscle or inch of muscle around their waistline, and they're squatting 500 pounds for reps. Well, they're going to get a little bit of core hypertrophy if they're not using something like a belt that lets them utilize their core with less muscle recruitment in their core to keep their stability, because it gives it a wall to press against. So for those people who want to keep their waistline just a little smaller, but they don't mind having a weaker core accordingly, could go ahead and utilize a belt also. All right, next question. Hi JJ, what are the effects of anxiety or depression on recovery? Physiological as well as psychological. There's a lot of ways you could look at that. Is it safe to say that anxiety and depression could reduce your effects of your training, your results in the gym, your results to your specific sport you train for, your fitness? Absolutely. The first thing to consider is that their actual lack, they can affect your motivation itself. And if you're not motivated to train as consistently, or you're not motivated to train as hard, well, your results are going to suffer. So that's the first immediate psychological response. But the other thing is the stress levels that they induce, particularly anxiety, but even depression, can cause your body to have more chronically elevated stress hormones. Those chronically elevated stress hormones may very well impede your recovery to your training. And if that happens, then that will also reduce your results. So can these mental issues, can they actually contribute to physical issues in regards to your results in the gym with your training? Absolutely. Not just the psychological, but also the hormonal response could absolutely, I could see that being an issue. I don't think it's really been studied, but just looking at the way the body works, it isn't an unreasonable conclusion to think that they could negatively affect your recovery to your training of any type of training. All right, next question. Jason, do you think more powerlifting federations should use squat and deadlift bars instead of just using the same bar for all three lifts? Can you tell your opinions? Yes, I think they should, but I'm also biased because I compete in a big federation that has mandatory equipment. Things like monoliths aren't optional. Certain types of benches are not optional. We do use different bars. We actually use actual deadlift bars for the deadlifts, so I'm biased, but maybe some smaller federations that people are competing in with smaller budgets may not have access to this equipment, and that's fine in some ways, but I would also say, well, why aren't you competing in the bigger federations? I mean, a lot of them have a lot to offer, such as the appropriate equipment, such as mine, the WPC. You're going to have the appropriate equipment there. And I think this can be problematic for some people if they're used to training on something very, very different than what they compete with. It can become problematic. If you're used to pulling with a deadlift bar and they make you deadlift with the squat bar, you might find that your grip becomes an issue when you go to deadlift at a meet. Or if they force you to squat with a deadlift bar because that's all they have, you get that extra whip in the bar, it could lower your numbers a little bit. You could hit a sticking point in the middle as a result of it just out of the hole. So it can affect your performance, absolutely. And so I do agree that they should be using the appropriate equipment. And again, if you're concerned about that, just join a bigger federation that it does have higher equipment standards. It will require the correct bars be used. Alright guys, so that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it has been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time in part 2.